journey to the Catholic faith has been an unusual one. And when the door opened over the last year or so for me to return, as you know, Bob Jones University is based in Greenville, South Carolina. For me to come full circle and be led back to be a Catholic priest in Greenville, South Carolina, don't you tell me the Lord doesn't have a sense of humor. I'll actually be serving also as a priest at the great parish of St. Mary's in Greenville, pastored by a former Baptist convert, also the parochial vicar's a Baptist, who's now a Catholic priest, and all of this 2 miles from the doorstep of Bob Jones. So I don't know what the Lord has up his sleeve, but I think there's something there, and it's great to be there at this time and be part of this great ministry. Now, you know, sometimes the English make fun of American tourists because, well, Americans come a long way to go and visit Europe, and they very often have to cram an awful lot into a very small space of time. And so they're used to going on tours where they begin in Rome on Monday, and then they go on to Switzerland and Vienna, and then they go on around, and usually by the end of the week, you know, Mildred from Minnesota is saying, "George, where are we?" And you know, he says, "Well, it's Thursday, we must be in Denmark." And they cram an awful lot into a very short period of time. Well, it's my job to help you, to give you that kind of a tour this evening of English church history. And what we're going to do is begin at the beginning and make a whirlwind tour through the history of the church in England, so you can see how it all fits together for what comes for the rest of the conference. To be able to do this, I'll also be touching on 2 particular areas of misunderstanding, one at the very beginning and one at the very end, where perhaps we can put some things right and get a few tools for apologetics and begin to understand how others look at the church and therefore what the facts are and how we can help to correct that little bit. I have an apology for you as well. I'm a lover of English history and studied it on my own for a long time, but I'm not a professional historian. So if you wanted a professional historian's point of view, I'm sorry, you're going to get an amateur's. But an amateur, of course, means one who does it out of love. So I hope that you'll share my enthusiasm and my joy in the history of England and share a little bit of my love for England as well. And also, if you share some of that, maybe share some of my sense of grief when we go through the events of the English Reformation, because there's great sadness there as well as a great joy. Also, I've got some pictures for you. I've got a PowerPoint presentation. I hope you don't mind. Can we actually get that up there? There we go. And I'm going to be gesturing for the next slide to come up, and it's going to be like when you're in the auction and you scratch your nose and you just paid the $1,000 or something you didn't want. So I hope we get the right slides at the right time. But first, I'd like to share with you a little bit about my own journey of how things happened for me. Yes, I was brought up in Pennsylvania and went to Bob Jones University. While I was there, I was an English and speech student, and so I was studying English literature and got a severe case of Anglophilia. The love of all things English. I had the opportunity to visit England on a Bob Jones mission trip. We went to work in Scotland with evangelical fundamentalist missionaries who were over there trying to convert people. And I can remember very clearly knocking on doors and visiting and telling people about the gospel as a young college student. And all the time, in this little Scottish town, seeing the Scottish Episcopal Church up on the hill. Beautiful old stone church. By that time, I was already going to a little Anglican breakaway church in Greenville, South Carolina, and become an Anglican. And I can remember on that mission trip thinking about that little Episcopal church, I'd love to be the pastor of a church like that one day. It was a kind of nostalgic, romantic dream I had. But then the opportunity came for me to go over to England and study and be ordained as a Catholic, as an Anglican priest. And eventually I did end up being a pastor of a beautiful country church. One of the things that drew me to the Anglican church was this love of history. I was brought up in Pennsylvania in an independent Bible church, which was founded in 1963. So good on what's new, but not so good on what was old. And so I had a longing, I think, I was attracted to the antiquity of the Anglican Church. Also, as an English major, I'd read all the English poets. I'd read C.S. Lewis and T.S. Eliot and George Herbert and John Donne, and was attracted to the literary tradition of England, and of course to the beauty of the Anglican worship. That summer, while I was a Bob Jones student, I spent a week in London before I flew home. I still remember creeping off with prayer book in hand to choral evensong in Westminster Abbey, and sitting there and thinking, I'd like to be the bishop of this church one day. No, not really. But having the enthusiasm for all things English at that point, and feeling that I wanted to go and study. And so it all worked out. I went to England and lived there for 25 years, married an English girl, and ended up as an Anglican country parson. This is the church that I was actually ministering in. Next one. This is St. Mary's Church in Brading on the Isle of Wight. And this is the other church, Yaveland. That's next to a Jacobean manor house. Yaveland Church, the little church there to the left in the second photo, and Brading Church, both built just after the Norman invasion in 1066. However, built on the site of earlier Saxon churches. Now, I'm sharing this bit from the Isle of Wight with you to show how steeped in history England is. Everywhere you go, there's some wonderful historical monument. Now, I could give you a little tour of my parish in England, in the Isle of Wight, and you would be able to pick out all of the great events of English church history right there. Just as a little example, for instance, in the parish were the remains of a Roman villa. This is a picture of the mosaics on the floor in the Roman villa in the parish where I was a priest. The Romans were there. They built a lovely country house right by the harbor, and a farmer in the 1950s, when he was plowing, came across these mosaics. If you wandered around the parish further, you came across the site where my parish church stood, where it was reputed that St. Wilfrid actually came to evangelize the island in the 8th century. In another part of the parish, St. Boniface, on his mission from England to Germany, was supposed to have visited. And then you went into the medieval parish church, which had been built in the 1100s, on the site of an earlier church, on the site of what was a pagan temple. And in that medieval church, if you knew how to read it, you could see the bits that were built in the 11th century, the extensions in the 13th, the little chapel built on in the 14th. And then you could take a walk through the parish and visit the country house where Charles I spent his last night of freedom. And then you could go back into the church and you could see where the medieval monuments had been bashed up by Cromwell's troops. All of this crammed into one very ordinary parish in England. And it's this history crammed into every little nook and cranny in England, which is so fascinating and so wonderful to be deep into that and to share in that. And in the Anglican ministry, of course, it is possible to do that. Now, I put all that together to really take us into the very first start, the very beginning, or the very first element of the Christian church in England. And what I like to do is actually set up something here that some Anglicans actually believe now, and show what the truth is. There's something going around at the moment which is called Celtic Christianity. You come across Celtic Christianity? It's all the rage at the moment. There are various permutations of it, and it's some of it's authentic, some of it's just nostalgic. Basically, it's a hearkening back to the Celtic Church, which was the Celtic Church was a bit Franciscan in its ethos. It was a great lover of nature. It was a great lover of prayer and spirituality and spiritual freedom, or so we're told. And this Celtic church, which is very popular at the moment, is very popular within Episcopalian or Anglican circles too. And it is for one very clear reason. What they try to do, as they say, is that some Anglicans or Episcopalians will say that the Celtic church was the original British church. And the Celts, if you don't know, were the original British tribes. And they became Christians first, and they existed for 600 years before St. Augustine came to Canterbury and brought in that Roman church with all its rules and all its dogma and its pope. Before that, the British church was this beautiful Celtic church. And so some Anglicans and Episcopalians would want to say, it's all right for us to be separate from Rome because our original church, the Celtic church, was separate from Rome. Now, this particular theory actually is not accurate. We can trace the beginnings of Christianity in Rome to the Emperor Claudius. The picture on the left is an actual bust of Claudius found in Britain. Archaeologists found it there in Britain. He was the emperor who led the Roman troops to invade Britain in AD 43, just 10 years after the crucifixion of our Lord. The picture on the right is Derek Jacobi, who you might remember played Claudius in the famous BBC series I, Claudius. Anyone seen that? Oh, go and get it out from the library. It's fantastic, an entertaining view of history of that time period. And actually, Derek Jacobi actually looks a bit like him. It was Claudius who invaded Britain. Okay, and he invaded Britain successfully, and in AD 43, the Roman occupation, which was to last for just about 400 years, began. Now, there is a view that the Christians actually came into Britain through Joseph of Arimathea. Do you know this theory? This is a wonderful theory. It's beautiful. If only it were true. The idea is that Joseph of Arimathea with Lazarus and St. Mary Magdalene got on a boat and they went to France. Heard this before? Okay. Well, Mary Magdalene stayed in France and started the Da Vinci Code. And Joseph of Arimathea stayed on the boat and went to England, where he started the Christian church. Okay? In fact, Joseph of Arimathea was supposed to be an uncle of Jesus. And Jesus himself, during those silent years, went to England with Joseph of Arimathea. And William Blake wrote a very famous poem, which has been turned into an English hymn, and it says, "And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Son of God in England's verdant pastures seen?" All going along with this idea that Joseph of Arimathea visited Glastonbury. That's a picture of Glastonbury with his famous Tor, which is the big mountain with the church on top, Church of St. Michael, very mysterious and mystical place. And that Joseph of Arimathea started the Christian faith in Glastonbury around the year 67. There's not really any evidence for this as far as the scholars can say. But it's a beautiful story. Glastonbury is a very ancient place, and a very ancient Christian place. The most ancient shrine to Our Lady north of the Alps was in Glastonbury. So the roots of Christianity are very ancient there, but whether Joseph of Arimathea went there or not is, well, it's probably not so. Instead, what probably happened was that the first Christians were Roman soldiers or slaves, coming in with the invading Roman armies and the Roman settlers in those first centuries. There's a little bit of evidence from the mid-2nd century, maybe just some pottery shards that they found. Remember, Christianity was persecuted at this time, and so the evidence is not going to be there very much. But some of them, a very interesting find is a pottery piece of pottery with an acrostic from the Lord's Prayer. In other words, the letters of the Lord's Prayer are all jumbled up. So it was like a puzzle, like those first sort of fish signs where the Christians made a secret sign where they were, and they think that maybe this sign would have been hung over a doorway so the Christians would know the puzzle. They would know this paternoster acrostic that was there. This is maybe middle of the 2nd century, end of the 2nd century. What we do know is that the first Christians in Britain were not the Celtic Christians, they were Roman Christians, because they were Romans. Their faith had come from Rome. And like any invading, occupying army, they looked home for their guidance. They looked home to Rome. Remember the famous quotation by Irenaeus in the middle of the 2nd century, I think it is. Remember what he says about all those who would start any unauthorized assemblies? He says, "We'll put to confusion all those who either from waywardness or conceit or blindness or obstinacy combine together against the truth. We'll confound them by pointing to the tradition derived from the apostles of that great and illustrious church, founded and organized at Rome by the two glorious apostles, Peter and Paul." Now, Irenaeus, of course, was writing in Lyon, in France, just across the water. And so by the middle of the 2nd century, we can assume that there were probably some Christians there in Britain. And they were Roman Christians. We assume also that they were starting to convert the local people, but the first Christians were not actually cut off from Rome. They were indeed themselves Romans. By the time we get to the middle of the 3rd century, Tertullian and Origen both mention the British Church. They're writing in North Africa. And they mention the church in Britain in passing, but it shows that there was enough of a church in Britain by then, for them in North Africa to have heard of it. If you go on a bit further, by the 4th century, there's abundant evidence of the Christian church in Britain. St. Alban is the first British martyr in 304. And then there were bishops, Roman bishops at the Council of Arles in 314, the Council of Rimini in 329, I think it was. And then, of course, there's archaeological evidence. Here's a 4th century Roman British mosaic, like the ones on the floor of the Roman villa in my parish in Brading. They weren't Christian, but this one is. It's a picture of one which is found elsewhere in Britain. There's a picture of the head of Christ. Do you see the Chi-Rho sign behind him? That's early 4th century in Britain. Look at this. In 1975, in a field near Cambridge, a farmer was plowing and he turned up this 4th century silverware, Roman silverware. Guess what? It's Christian liturgical silverware. The oldest in the world. They know because it has Chi-Rho signatures on it and has inscriptions around the chalice and around the plate, which says, "I, Publius, dedicate this to the Lord." Okay? Beautiful. It means that in early or mid-4th century Britain, the Mass was being celebrated, not only celebrated, but celebrated in style. Okay? So, the church in Britain was Roman from the very beginning. In the year 410, the Roman legions depart, and at that point, Britain starts to descend into chaos. The order that the Romans brought went with the Romans, and Roman settlers stayed there, but also they were mixing with the local people, the Celts and various different tribes. And you might say, well, at that point, maybe this Celtic church, independent of Rome, maybe that's when it started. Maybe that's when this beautiful, glorious church, this Celtic church that was independent of Rome, got going. Not really, because in the 4th century, there was a particular heresy. Anyone remember what it was? Yeah, but the Pelagian heresy? Pelagius was actually a British monk who went out to the continent, began to preach a heresy that you could be saved by works. And the Roman church sat on that and suppressed it and said, no, that's a heresy, that's not the truth. And it was a British deacon in 429 who actually appealed to the Pope and asked for the Pope to send a missionary to try to counter the Pelagian heresy. So in the 4th century, you have British clergy getting in touch with the Pope of Rome saying, please send someone to minister to us because of your authority. Saint Germain of Auxerre went, and a person called St. Patrick went with him. So here's elements of the Celtic Church. The Roman occupation ends in 410. There's the Pelagian controversy. Germain of Auxerre's missions was in 429 and 447. He actually went and combated Pelagianism, started seminaries, trained priests, made sure the catechesis was in place. And then St. Patrick's mission to Ireland. St. Patrick went to Ireland to convert people, not because there was already a Celtic church there. He went there in 533 and found bloodthirsty, cannibalistic Druids. Not a beautiful Celtic church that had been founded by Joseph of Arimathea. Okay? And Patrick was a true son of the Roman Church. Probably born in Scotland. His mother was actually a kinswoman of St. Martin of Tours. St. Patrick was sent by the Pope to Ireland on his mission. Around 450, the Saxons begin to invade Britain because it's vulnerable, because the Romans have pulled out, and then the Celtic Christians flee west and south, and the Saxons come in, and a lot of British Christianity is persecuted and dies out. Now, during that time, for about 150 to 200 years, there was a Celtic church, pretty much geographically cut off from Rome. But then in 597, St. Augustine is sent by Pope St. Gregory the Great to convert England. He arrives in Canterbury, and he finds that there are already some Christians there because the Celts, the Celtic Church had started to re-evangelize from Ireland into Scotland and then coming down into the northern parts of Britain. And in those 150 to 200 years, some differences of discipline had come about, and the Celtic Church disagreed about very important things like which way the monk should cut his hair. But also they disagreed about the date of Easter. And so they had a quarrel back and forth. And basically what happened was at 664, at the Synod in Whitby in the north of England, the two sides got together to try to have an agreement. They listened to the arguments, and the Celtic Church at that point listened to St. Wilfrid, who was arguing the side for the Pope, and said, well, said the Celtic king, Peter holds the keys to heaven. If I want to get into heaven, I better agree with Peter. And so the Celtic Church came over to the Roman discipline. So 664, the Synod of Whitby, is an important time when these two strands of British Christianity were reconciled, came back together. I'm going to start moving a bit more quickly now. Hold tight. Stay with me if you can. Pay attention. 7th to 9th century British Christianity. This is a great time in the church. These Celtic missionaries had really a wonderful culture, a great culture of learning, erudition, study, theology, spirituality. And when their wonderful tradition was merged with the Roman discipline and with the Roman tradition, it was dynamite. They went all over the world. They were the powerhouse of Christianity in Europe during this time. St. Cuthbert was a wonderful missionary. St. Wilfrid, an abbot of Ripon and a bishop of York, was going back and forth to Rome. We underestimate the amount of time they traveled and how quickly they traveled in the ancient world. You could actually get from Rome to the north of Britain pretty quickly. They traveled back and forth. The Pope sent out missionaries from Rome. They went to study in the continent, and Christians from the continent came to Britain to study as well. In 667, Theodore of Canterbury is appointed the archbishop by the Pope. This shows the universality and the activity in the church of the time. Theodore of Canterbury was a Greek, appointed by a Roman Pope to be the Archbishop of Canterbury in England. Okay, so it was really a village church. The national boundaries we imagine now didn't exist then. Theodore comes in and he establishes the hierarchy and formalizes everything. He establishes parishes and dioceses. In fact, the dioceses and the parishes in the Church of England today, for the most part, are still what Theodore created back in the 7th century. Some other wonderful characters from the church at that time: St. Benedict Bishop, who founded wonderful monasteries in the north with libraries and full of learning, and people came to study there from all over Europe. St. Willibrord was a missionary to the Germans. St. Boniface, another missionary to the Dutch and the Germans, ended up organizing the church in Germany and ended up as a martyr. And then in 730, the Venerable Bede, a monk in Jarrow, up in the north of England, wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people. Who's read this? Wow. It actually makes good reading if you slow down enough. In 826, Ansgar is another Benedictine missionary, this time to Denmark. So England was actually the source of a great amount of missionary effort out into Northern Europe. And of course, they made good missionaries back to Northern Europe because that's where the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons had come from. So they're missionaries back to their countrymen, if you like. 10th and 11th century British Christianity. Well, the 900s were in many ways a dark age for the church. There were some pretty bad popes then. If people think the Borgia popes were bad, they should read about the ones in the 900s. It was a dark time for the church generally as well, and this missionary effort from Britain slowed down a bit. In many ways, it was a time of consolidation. The monasteries began to be established that much more and really settled in. You have to imagine Britain at this time as being mostly forest, without any big towns or cities. People were frightened because of the invasions that kept on happening. The monasteries became the centers of civilization. They were built like fortresses. They were places of protection. That's where the health care was. That's where the schools were. That's where the worship was. That's where the commerce was. That's where the diplomacy went from. And so the monasteries became these havens of civilization in the midst of the wilderness that was Britain during this time. The Anglo-Saxons eventually consolidated their gains in England. A great and holy king, St. Edward the Confessor, was probably the summit and the peak of their achievement, and that was just before the Norman invasion in 1066. After that, there was a great wave of church building. Church and state consolidated. My little churches on the Isle of Wight were built at that point. The Normans came in and built a lot of churches. The Anglo-Saxon churches were usually in wood and thatch, and the Normans came in with their new architecture and built the beautiful stone churches that you still see today if you visit Britain. If you know how to read an old church, you can go in and see in almost all of the ancient parish churches and cathedrals parts of Norman architecture that are still there, over 1,000 years old. Anselm of Canterbury was a famous philosopher and theologian at that time. Let's move on a little bit faster. 12th and 13th century British Christianity. This is getting into the High Middle Ages. A few key points. The murder of Thomas à Becket. That was a clash between church and state going on even then. The Franciscans and the Dominicans get started about now. And in the 1220s, they reach Britain. By then, other things are beginning to happen as well. The towns are beginning to form much more away from the monasteries. Oxford and Cambridge universities are beginning to be founded, the other universities in Europe, and people are beginning to come together for commerce and for trade in these new towns that are being formed, in the safety that's provided. And the Dominicans and the Franciscans are there ministering in the towns as wandering preachers instead of monks who are kept in a particular place. 14th and 15th century Christianity in Britain comes into a new flowering again. Things are happening in the continent as well. And if we spend a minute looking at these things, we'll see how some of the things which happen now in the 13 and 1400s are actually beginning to lay the foundation for what's going to happen in the Reformation. Okay, up to the 13 and 1400s, England and the religion in Britain was still what it had been for nearly 1,000 years. Based around the monasteries, it was secure, it was set, it was a medieval world. There was a lot of superstition because there wasn't a lot of learning, but there was a lot of piety and simple devotion as well. Now things begin to change a bit. William of Ockham is an Englishman. You can find the village of Ockham in Surrey today. And William of Ockham was a Franciscan, and he is known for Ockham's razor, which is the philosophical view that the simplest answer is usually the best. He's also known for nominalism. Nominalism, and excuse me launching into philosophy here, but nominalism is basically the philosophy that says that the things that we talk about are just names. They don't have any reality. What I'm saying is this: if you say this is a lectern, some people believe that there is such a thing as a real lectern out there in the world of ideas, because this lectern is going to be broken up and burn and disappear one day given enough time. It's not permanent. But there's a permanent lectern out there in the world of ideas. William of Ockham said, no, there isn't. Lectern is lectern, and the word that you say for lectern is just the word that you want to use for lectern. It's just a name. You might as well call it gobbledygook. Okay? In other words, this philosophy is going around, he was saying there isn't anything else out there. And the things that we call, when we use words for things, it's just a fiction. It's just a word that we use. There's no real identity or reality out there. Have I lost you yet? Okay. I'm only going into this because it's actually very important, because William of Ockham and nominalism was a big influence on Martin Luther and on the Reformation. Okay? And you can see how this kind of fits in with your view of the sacraments and your view of the church. Okay? If you're saying that with this sacrament, this bread and the substance of this bread is transformed into the substance of our Lord's body, blood, soul, and divinity, so you believe in those realities that are invisible to the human eye. And William of Ockham, deep down, didn't. He said, no, it's just bread. Because those other realities don't really exist. Now, it's very important that William of Ockham is there, because his philosophical thinking is actually affecting what's going to happen about 200 years later. At the same time in Europe, there's something called the Devotio Moderna. A little bit later, this is when the Imitation of Christ was written. This Devotio Moderna was a new kind of spirituality which was for ordinary people. Okay? It was a down-to-earth spirituality that everybody could relate with. The English mystic Julian of Norwich is writing during this time. So is Richard Rolle, the author of The Cloud of Unknowing. There was a kind of personal mysticism and a personal spirituality which became popular now, which hadn't existed before in quite the same way. Can you see how that begins to lay the foundation for the individualism of the Reformation, which is going to come later? Okay. This new fervor that's there. I can know God. I can hunger for God. I can thirst for God. I can get to know Him and have a relationship. I can imitate Christ. It's wonderful. It's not a bad thing. But that thinking of individualism and personal experience begins to lay the foundation. John Wycliffe in 1381 begins to translate the Bible into English. Also influenced by William of Ockham and nominalism, he starts undermining the Catholic truths as they've been believed for the last 1,300 years. And it's not so bad that he translated the Bible into English, but what he added was lots of notes and lots of mistranslations in order to support his own theological views. His followers are called the Lollards, and they're being persecuted at the turn of the century. And then another great English saintly king, Henry VI, comes along. Henry VI was the simple, humble king who believed in serving his people, who believed in those 10 things that Marcus spoke about at the very beginning, about service and about humility and about obedience and about love and about holiness. Henry VI founded lots of churches and colleges. The great chapel at King's College in Cambridge was founded by Henry VI. The great private school, Eton, and its look-alike chapel, look-alike to King's in Cambridge, was founded by Henry VI. Henry VI is, if you like, in my mind, he's the end of Catholic England. Okay? He was a great Catholic king and a great Catholic monarch who maintained the Catholic faith in a very beautiful way. 1478, St. Thomas More is born. 1485 is the War of the Roses, in which the houses of Lancaster and Tudor fight against each other, and Henry VII prevails. Henry VII is the father of Henry VIII. Okay? In 1509, Henry VIII succeeds to the throne. Where are we, George? It's Thursday, must be Denmark. Okay? That was a pretty quick view all the way through of English history, church history, from the Romans to the dawn of the Reformation. What I'd like to do now is take a moment to ask another question, which Marcus raised. What was that church like at the beginning of the 1500s? What do we know about it? Well, the view that I got, and which many of you got perhaps as well, is that it was a corrupt church of fat, jolly monks who were scaring everybody with the fires of purgatory and charging them money. Well, clergymen seem to have a habit for scaring people with the fires of hell and charging them money, whether they were in the 15th century Europe or in televangelists of the 20th century. Okay, it doesn't make it right, but it's a common failing. But that was the view we were given, and that we had, and you know, things needed to change. And Henry VIII was, well, he was a bit of a rascal, really, wasn't he? And all those wives, and a jolly old fellow. And he changed things, and well, if they had to break a few eggs to make omelets, well, so be it. I think the speakers later in the conference are going to go into detail on just how many eggs were broken and how many omelets weren't actually made. But I can actually try to share with you what the church was like in England at that time. And what I'd like to do is read from this excellent book by Christopher Hay, an Oxford historian. And forgive me if I read long passages, he just says it better than I can, okay? And he's talking about a document written by a fellow called Roger Martin. Roger Martin. And Roger Martin was this was his parish church. It's the church of Long Melford in Suffolk. The thing you see at the back, the big structure at the back, is the Lady Chapel. That's because Long Melford was on the pilgrimage route from London to Walsingham. And pilgrims would stop in Long Melford, and one of the Marian shrines that they would visit on the way to the Great Marian Shrine at Walsingham was the shrine here in this Lady Chapel, in this beautiful church of Long Melford. Now, Roger Martin this was his church, okay? He lived right during this time period. And towards the end of his long life, he died there in 1615. Okay, so he was a boy during the time of all the Reformation, everything, all the upset. And he wrote a reminiscence of what the church life was like in that time. He says, the church's interior was dominated by the great rood, or the crucifix, standing high in the loft between nave and chancel, flanked by images of the Virgin Mary and St. John the Evangelist. On the front of the loft, facing the congregation, the 12 apostles were painted, and the roof above was decorated with gilded stars. Beyond the rood was the high altar. To the left was a large statue of the Trinity, patron of the church. The church inventory of Long Melford for 1529 supplies further detail of the church and its services. There were 23 images in the church, statues of Saints Andrew and Anthony, Christopher George, John the Baptist, Anne, Catherine, Margaret, Mary Magdalene, each with a decorated cloth hanging before it. The images of the Blessed Virgin had gorgeous coats and jewels. The church had 13 silver and gilt chalices for its masses, 15 copes, 27 antiphonals, graduals, and processionals. These would have all been beautifully illuminated, hand-copied manuscripts. Martin lovingly recalls the festivals of the church year. On Palm Sunday, There was a parish procession around the churchyard with the consecrated host. The church bells were rung, the choir sang, and the procession returned to the church porch with flowers and holy bread strewn over the choir boys. On Maundy Thursday, candles were set in a painted frame before the Easter sepulchre, where the sacrament was reserved for veneration. On Good Friday, the priest went up into the rood loft. The rood loft is a great high screen with a beautiful big crucifix on top. He went up there to sing the Passion. The choir was rewarded for its efforts with dinner at Great Melford Hall 3 times a year. On the eve of St. James' Day, there was a village bonfire with a tub of ale and bread for the poor. Sounds fun. There were bonfires and ale in front of the Martins' home on Midsummer Eve and on the eve of Saints Peter and Paul. And for St. Thomas' Eve bonfire, the family provided mutton pie and peas, as well as the usual bread and ale. And with all these bonfires, some of the friends and the more civil poor neighbours were called in to dine by candlelight with Roger's grandfather, as a taper burned before the image of St. John the Baptist in the hall. Okay. There's a little village community there which is Catholic, which is living out the Catholic faith in a very deeply sacramental way. The fasts and the festivals of the year all being lived together as a community. The rich sharing with the poor praying for the rich. Eamon Duffy, the Cambridge historian, explains it this way. He says, there was a beautiful sacramental understanding of the ministry of the social work in the church. And it went like this. The poor, because of the Beatitudes, were understood to be closer to heaven. Therefore, the rich, in their wills and in their testaments, left money for the poor, so the poor could be looked after, and also so that the poor would pray for them after they died. There was a continuity between heaven and earth. There was a continuity between the living and the dead. And the continuity was kept alive through charitable sharing, praying for one another, giving to one another, and living the life of Christ together. The documents show that at the Reformation, all of that was scattered. All of it was broken. And those who speak after me will no doubt begin to address some of that. What are some other signs of the health of the church at this time period? Well, one of the things is that we can go back and look at the sort of books which were being published. In 1530, on the eve of the Reformation, the London printer Robert Redmond published a bestseller. It was called A Work for Householders. Despite its unpromising title, the book went through 2 editions in 1530 and 3 more in 1531, and by 1537 it had been printed 8 times. Now, this book for householders basically gave ordinary people rules and ideas for implementing a spiritual life in their household. It told fathers and mothers how to lead prayers for their children, how to set up services for their servants, and how to observe the proper fasts and feasts in the church. It was a huge bestseller. Lots and lots of other religious books, which I don't have time to go into this evening, were also great bestsellers. They were books of ordinary devotion and ordinary piety for ordinary people, not scholarly tomes for monks and monasteries. These were books which people bought to read, to learn how to grow closer to Christ, how to be better Catholics. Another sign of life at this time is to go through the last wills and testaments. There are thousands of them that still exist. And historians over the last 30 or 40 years have been going through them and finding out that in the 1520s, 1530s, at the eve of the Reformation, the vast, vast majority of people left huge amounts of their money and their property, and when they died, to the church, to monasteries, to friaries, to poorhouses, to hospitals, to schools, all of them run by their local church. And their wills are actually religious documents. They'll say things like, I, Dwight Longenecker, believing in the most holy Trinity and trusting my soul to the mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ through the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary, wish to make amends for the faults in my life and therefore go on and give all of my money to the poor. or to the church, or to the priest, to found new chantry chapels for more priests and more masses to be said. The historian J.J. Scarisbrick was the one who first started to do all this work and find the real religious fervor in the church at that time. Another sign of life are the guilds and fraternities. What's a guild or a fraternity? Well, think of this as a local level combination of an insurance company, fellowship group, prayer group, and businessman's meeting. Okay? In local parishes, the young men, the young women, the matrons, the businessmen all had their various different guilds. They raised money. They gave the money to the church. They furnished the church. They rebuilt new parts of the church. They funded almshouses and houses for the poor and hospitals. They looked after their loved ones. They looked after the widows and the orphans. And the life was actually very lively and very committed. All of the parishes had them. Some of them were big and influential and wealthy. Others were just very small groups of people who raised money to provide candles for the image of St. John or whatever their favorite was in the church. And it wasn't just stuff going on in the church, as I say, it was the way the charity was done in the church. All of this was done by the lay people. They were fervent, they were keen, they were enthusiastic, they were generous, and it was their apostolate. And apart from the idea that it was controlled by the monks and the clergy, this was initiated by the lay people and run by the lay people. And a large proportion of the priests at that time were actually hired and paid for by the guilds and the fraternities. And who pays the piper calls the tune. Okay? So they actually hired the priests for their chantries. They actually went out and raised the money and paid for them. And so rather than the church being dominated by the clergy, as we're very often told, it was motivated from the grassroots level, and the people were fervent about their faith, and they were very keen to hang on to it. Another aspect is, if you would judge that if the church was actually decaying and in need of reform and was about to die, you would say, well, what about the state of the churches? The church buildings, which remember by now were already 500, 600 years old or older, they were in a terrific state of repair. In fact, they were being built again. They were being torn down and renewed. New extensions were being put out. New towers were being put up. New wings were being built. New spires were being built. Cathedrals and parish churches all over the land were having money spent on them. And if you spend money on buildings, you're investing in the future, aren't you? Okay, so all over England, you can see that at this time period, at the late 1400s, early 1500s, there's a huge new surge of church buildings. The style is called perpendicular. It's a wonderful new English architectural phenomenon. If you ever go to Bath in Wiltshire, Bath Abbey is built at this time. So a huge range of new church building going on. Furthermore, there's a healthy number of vocations, not just to the secular priesthood, but also to the religious life. The monasteries actually, when Henry VIII's commissioners went around to inspect them, found that actually there was not very much corruption at all. There was some laxity, there was some laziness, there was a little bit of mild corruption here and there, but they actually found the numbers were higher than they had been 50 or 100 years ago, the number of monks and nuns, that the buildings were in much better condition, that the finances were in good shape, and there was very little corruption. The number of vocations to the secular priesthood were higher than they had been for the last 20, 30, 50 years. That's because there were more and more priests who were needed, because the towns were growing, the cities were growing, more churches were being built, and so there were a large number of priestly vocations. What happened to those vocations after the Reformation, I hope someone else will tell you about. Another sign of life is the relative health of the clerical life. When there was a particular preacher called John Colet, who was calling for reformation amongst the bishops and calling for reformation amongst the corrupt clergy. And in fact, when they went and inspected, there wasn't that much problem. There weren't that many bishops. There was one or two who were living a corrupt life. But in fact, the state of the clerical life and the state of the religious life in the church was very healthy. There was also an investment in the future of the people in all the different ways that I've already outlined. And finally, there was a widespread dislike of any kind of new religion amongst the people themselves. They wanted to be catechized, they wanted to believe the faith, and they were very suspicious of heresy and of any new ways. They themselves were. Not that it was imposed from outside. And so all of these signs of life in the church at that time give the lie to the idea that the church in England in the late 1400s and early 1500s was moribund, corrupt, decadent, on its last legs, and needed a good old breath of the Holy Spirit. In fact, in England, different from most of the rest of Europe at the time, they didn't have some of the levels of corruption. As far as I know, the whole thing about indulgences being sold to build St. Peter's and so forth, as far as I know, that wasn't an issue in England at all. Because there was a high level of respect and a high level of real Christian fervor and Christian faith amongst the people, right from the grassroots level up through to the bishops. I need to leave you right there. I hope I've left you at a cliff edge. Pick it up next time in 1529 with the problems that Henry VIII has. I'm going to leave you with this slide, which gives you some wonderful books to read. Let me go through them for you very quickly. I hope you can read those. I've already mentioned the Venerable Bede. He's been around for some time. But also some books there on medieval monasticism, very interesting if you're interested in that time period. The three authors I would really pick out and emphasize are J.J. Scarisbrick, The Reformation and the English People, Christopher Hay, English Reformations, and the books by Eamon Duffy. Eamon Duffy's Stripping of the Altars is a great, huge, fat book. You can use that for a doorstop. And but The Voices of Morbath is a wonderful little book about one particular parish's experiences from the very beginning of Henry VIII's reign right through the different reformations that happened through Edward and Mary and Elizabeth. And Duffy goes through the accounts of that parish very carefully and draws out all sorts of interesting details and relates them with all the other events that are going on at the time. But one very ordinary little parish in the west of England and how they went through the Reformation, what the reactions to it were and what the consequences were. The Voices of Morbath. Also, some very groundbreaking biographies have come out recently which reassess the characters of the Reformation. Jasper Ridley's biography of Henry VIII and David Lode's biography of Mary Tudor are especially important. I'd like to leave you with one quotation from Christopher Hayes. He says, and I'll finish with this quotation, "There is a very wide range of evidence to suggest that the ordinary religion of English parishes was in a healthy and vigorous state in the early 16th century. The English were investing heavily, perhaps more heavily than ever before. In 1530, the conventional religion of late medieval England was at its most luxuriant and energetic. There is nothing to indicate that we're on the eve of a Reformation, or that there was any decay of conventional piety. The political Reformation in England was not preceded by a collapse of Catholic Christianity, or even by any real contraction, but by a real consolidation of its considerable strength." Thank you very much.